freaking out. What was it like there?
I don't remember.
It was like, what's your
Shot coke with Alice in Chains all night. I don't remember.
In January 1993, Nirvana traveled to Brazil to play the Hollywood Rock Festival. After not playing a single show for a couple months, the band was ready to get back out there. But unfortunately, the 2 shows Nirvana would play that month would go down in infamy. The first show that took place on January 16th is widely regarded as the band's worst ever, while the January 23rd performance was troubled in its own way. There's a number of reasons as to why these shows were so disastrous, from drug use to intentional sabotage. Let's get into it. To give a bit of background, going into 1993, Nirvana was one of the biggest bands in the world. Kurt Cobain was also a full-blown addict. Following the release of Nevermind, the band's breakthrough album, he became a different person, largely living in his own world, as his reliance on heroin began to take over his life. Extensive touring and overall poor health led to Kurt using drugs as an escape. When not performing, Kurt spent the majority of 1992 in solitude, getting high with Courtney Love. After getting married and the birth of his child, Frances Bean, Kurt still couldn't clean up his act. As 1992 came to a close, Nirvana was on a break, and Kurt Cobain was now a father, still struggling with addiction. This leads us to Brazil, January 1993. In the middle part of January, Nirvana entered South America for the Hollywood Rock Festival. They shared a bill with Alice in Chains, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and L7. But almost immediately, there was a huge problem. Heroin was impossible to find in Brazil. So before Nirvana's first performance in São Paulo, Kurt had apparently mixed a ton of Valium with hard liquor. I believe it because this show was a total mess. The show kicked off fairly strong, not amazing or anything, but at the very least, the band seemed to be lucid. Performances of School, Drain You, Breed, and Sliver were all pretty good. Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers played trumpet during a rather sloppy rendition of Smells Like Teen Spirit, and a decent performance of Blue followed. But afterward, things really went downhill. As Chris and Dave jammed to Run to the Hills by Iron Maiden, Kurt methodically destroyed his guitar and gave pieces of it to the crowd. The band then swapped instruments, with Kurt on drums, Chris on guitar, and Dave on bass. This lasted for a total of 6 tracks, all of which were covers. Their cover of Seasons in the Sun was actually fairly solid for what it is, but the covers that followed were very rough, loose jams. Kids in America, Rio, and We Will Rock You are only a few. The band is just barely getting through the show at this point, sounding incredibly lethargic and borderline unlistenable. In order to get paid, they had to play for a whole 90 minutes. So it seems the sole goal here was to simply get to that 90-minute mark. Nirvana had all but given up on delivering a good show. It was painfully clear Kurt really did not want to be there. The band eventually returned to their normal instruments and got back on track after a bit, but not really. Lounge act toward the end of the show only contained bass and drums, while Kurt was in search of another left-handed guitar following the destruction of his black Strat. Chris got frustrated Kurt was taking too long to tune the guitar, so he hurled his bass at Kurt and walked off stage. When he returned, he didn't bother to retune it. Thus, the following track, Territorial Pissings, was also completely botched. Everything sounded horrible and out of time. By this point, some of the audience had already left, while others found enjoyment in this catastrophe. The final 2 songs of the night were brand new, Heart-Shaped Box and Scentless Apprentice. Scentless Apprentice is incomplete and not very good, but as the final song of the set, it inevitably led to some pretty satisfying destruction. Kurt elegantly jammed his guitar right into an amplifier, as well as destroyed stage lights and the drum kit. Now, Nirvana was certainly known for chaotic live shows, but on January 16, 1993, they broke new ground. I can definitely see why this is largely regarded as their worst. A lot of songs were incomplete, too messy to enjoy, and the band seemed very ill-prepared to play. In the limited amount of video footage available from the show, you see a band, primarily its frontman, really struggling to keep it together. Inebriation was a big factor, but not the only reason for Cobain and the band's angst. They were against the capitalist nature of the festival promoting a cigarette brand. They also hadn't played together in a while, resulting in some nervousness. many of the issues from the São Paulo show also plagued Nirvana's performance in Rio. After the show, Kurt would attend a party at Street Augusta with Courtney and João Gordo, who was in a local Brazilian thrash band. At first, Kurt did not want to be there. He was incredibly depressed, likely due to withdrawals, but as cocaine came into the picture as the night went on, Kurt's anguish turned to euphoria. The entire night consisted of heavy drinking and coke use. Nirvana was set to play Rio on January 23, 1993. Between this show and the last, Kurt had finally gotten his hands on heroin. While coke was easily obtainable, it took special planning to obtain the Big H. As I said earlier, Alice in Chains was on the same bill as Nirvana. Lane Staley was a well-known user along with Kurt, so the two teamed up to get the drug. Long story short, Kurt paid for the heroin, and Lane paid for a plane to transport it into the country. They now had their go-to fix, but things would go wrong very quickly. The night before Nirvana's Rio gig on January 22nd, Alice in Chains played with Red Hot Chili Peppers. Afterward, Kurt, Lane, and Mike Starr would shoot coke and heroin all night. Mike overdosed and apparently died for around 10 minutes before being revived. That January 22nd gig would be Mike's last with Alice in Chains, as he was ultimately kicked out following this incident. After a long night of substance abuse, Kurt mustered up the strength to play the second gig in Rio. While not even remotely as chaotic as the São Paulo gig, this show was far from Nirvana's best. This January 23rd performance saw Kurt clearly continuing this intentional sabotage. He despised what the Hollywood Rock Festival stood for, and he made every attempt to make that clear. Most notably during the 10-minute performance of Scentless Apprentice, exposing himself, spitting on the camera, and staggering around the stage in a drug-ridden stupor. He simply didn't care whatsoever. Musically, the January 23rd show was a lot more straightforward for Nirvana, featuring mostly original tracks and only a few covers. The band came across as tighter and more put together overall, especially Dave and Chris, as they held down the rhythm section while Kurt went off the rails at times. But this was the norm for Nirvana. Flea also returned with the trumpet on Smells Like Teen Spirit, being a much stronger performance compared to São Paulo. The first show in São Paulo displayed a very unhinged and inebriated Kurt Cobain, featuring a number of loosely jammed covers that were just painful. São Paulo was also one of the band's biggest shows, with a crowd of apparently over 100,000, which is a big reason the performance is so infamous. While the show in Rio, though not without its chaotic moments, was more standard affair for Nirvana, but rather depressing at moments. If anything, these shows saw the band slowly falling apart. Kurt was on a downward spiral, with his mental health deteriorating, along with a crippling addiction to heroin. He also had to deal with the pressures of fame and being a new father. It was very clear the passion he once had for music was quickly fading. These two shows in January '93 are evidence of that. This was the beginning of the end for not only Nirvana, but Kurt as well. Things were looking up the following month, when the band knocked out the recording for In Utero in less than 2 weeks. But for the most part, 1993 saw Kurt sink deeper and deeper into his addiction, and sadly, we all know how things would end for him on April 5th, 1994. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. More music-related content coming soon here on The Music Narrative.